Hello everyone. Our today's topic is blood supply to the brain and the spinal cord. First of all, we shall discuss is the blood supply to the spinal cord. So, why is the blood supply to the nervous tissue so important? We know that the nervous tissue it is a very delicate and it cannot survive without oxygen for more than 3 minutes. So, what we need is a constant and ample blood supply in order that it function properly. So let us move to the blood supply of the spinal cord. The spinal cord, remember, it receives its blood supply from three main arteries. The first is the anterior spinal artery, and there are posterior spinal arteries. So remember this anterior spinal artery, it is located in the anterior median sulcus. And two posterior spinal arteries, remember they run across the posterolateral sulcus. Now, in addition to these, there is arterial plexus that is also known as arteria vasocorna. So this plexus is known as arterial. So this network of arteries would cover the spinal cord and send branches into the substance of the cord. So where do the spinal artery originates from? Well, these spinal arteries, remember, they originate from the vertebral artery. The main source for the blood for the spinal arteries is the vertebral artery. The vertebral artery, it will provide blood to the anterior and the posterior spinal arteries, but this blood only reaches the cervical segment of the cord. For the rest of the spinal cord, the blood it is supplied by these radicular arteries. So can you tell me what radicular arteries are and where they come from? Well, the radicular arteries, they are the branches that reach the spinal cord along the route of the spinal nerves. So they come from the spinal branches of vertebral, ascending cervical, deep cervical, intercostal, lumbar and the sacral arteries. So most radicular arteries, they are small and they only supply the nerve root. However, one of these radicular artery is very large and has a special name that is known as arteria radicularis magna, and it can supply blood to as much as lower 2/3 of the spinal cord. Now let us talk about the venous drainage. So the veins draining the spinal cord, they are arranged in 6 longitudinal channels. The veins, they are connected by a network that is known as venous vasocorna, and the blood from these veins is known as, it is drained by radicular veins. So vein of the spinal cord, they are organized into 6 longitudinal channels that are interconnected by venous plexus that drain into the epidural plexus and then into the segmental veins. Now let us discuss about the arterial supply of the brain. Well, the brain, it is supplied by, remember, it is the brain, it receives blood supply from the two vertebral arteries. So this one and this one, these are the two vertebral arteries, and along with that we have two internal carotid arteries. So this internal carotid artery and this internal carotid artery. So the brain, it is supplied by, remember, two vertebral arteries and two internal carotid arteries. So let's start with the vertebral artery. The vertebral artery, remember, it's a branch of first part of the subclavian artery. So remember, there are four parts of the course of the vertebral artery. The first part, second part, third part, and the fourth part. The first part is, remember, of the vertebral artery has origin from the foramen transversarium of the sixth cervical vertebra. The second part, it goes from the foramen transversarium of the sixth to the first cervical vertebra. And the third part, it lies on the posterior arch of atlas vertebra. And the fourth part, it enters the cranium through foramen magnum and continue under the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane. So the first part starts from its origin. It originates from the subclavian artery. It is located just near your shoulder. So this part of the artery travels upward and reaches the foramen transversarium of the sixth cervical vertebra. So the first part of the vertebral artery, it starts from the subclavian artery and ends at the foramen transversarium of the sixth cervical vertebra. The second part, it continues its journey by passing through the foramen transversarium of the cervical vertebra, and it travels through the opening of sixth, fifth, fourth, third, second, and the first cervical vertebra. The third part, it lies on the posterior arch of the atlas vertebra. So remember, the atlas, it's the first cervical vertebra. So this part of the artery, it wraps around the top of the atlas vertebra. And the fourth part, it enters the cranium through the foramen magnum, that is the large opening at the base of skull, and it communicates through the under the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane. So that is the thin layer of the tissue that connects the atlas to the base of the skull. So can anyone tell me which arteries supply blood to the brain? It is supplied by two vertebral arteries and two internal carotid arteries. So what are the intracranial branches? So let us discuss that. The first is the posterior spinal artery. So the posterior spinal artery, remember, it is the first intracranial branch, and it passes inferiorly on the spinal medulla among the dorsal root of the spinal nerves. So what is the first intracranial branch of the vertebral artery? It's the posterior spinal artery. The second which is the largest branch? It's the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So the largest, remember, the largest branch is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. It supplies the lateral half of medulla and lower border of pons and cerebellum. Other is anterior spinal artery. The anterior spinal artery is formed by union of branches from each vertebral artery on the ventral surface of the medulla oblongata and supplies the median part of the medulla. So how is anterior spinal artery formed and what does it supply? The anterior spinal artery is formed by union of the branches from each vertebral artery and supplies the median part of medulla and entire length of the spinal cord. Apart from that, as the vertebral artery, it ascends along the medulla oblongata. It gives several medullary and meningeal branches. Next we are moving to is the basilar artery. So this one is the basilar artery. Remember how it is formed? It is formed by the union of these two vertebral arteries. So these vertebral arteries, they combine and form the basilar artery that arise at the lower border of the pons and supply, and it arises at the lower border of the pons and it lies in the medial groove of the pons, and it ends at the upper border of the pons by divided into two posterior cerebral artery. Now, what are the branches of basilar artery? Let us discuss that. The first, remember, the branches are the anterior inferior cerebral artery, this one, labyrinth artery, this one, pontine arteries, pontine branches, superior cerebral artery, this one, and the terminal posterior cerebral arteries. So remember, these are the branches of the basilar artery. So the anterior inferior cerebral artery, remember, so anterior inferior cerebellar artery, it arises at the lower border of pons and it supplies the 6th, 7th, 8th cranial nerve and antero-inferior part of the cerebellum. So this labyrinth artery accompanies the vestibulocochlear nerve and supply the internal ear. The pontine branch that supplies the pons, the superior cerebellar branch, it supplies the superior surface of cerebellum. And finally, the two terminal posterior cerebral arteries, it supplies the midbrain and part of the diaphragm. Other is the internal carotid artery. So it has various branches like cerebral part, cavernous part, and the petrous part. So remember, in the cerebral part, it enters after passing through the carotid artery. So can you tell me where it enters the cranial cavity? It enters after passing through the carotid canal and the superior aspect of the foramen lacerum. Now what does it do after that? It goes to the cavernous sinus and it ends next to the optic chiasma, and it divides it into two branches, the middle cerebellar artery and anterior cerebral artery. Remember the ophthalmic artery, it supplies the orbit, and the posterior communicating artery, It comes to the posterior cerebral artery and helps to complete the circle of blood vessels at the base of brain. How does the anterior choroidal artery play role? It supplies the part of brain like the crus cerebri and choroid plexus in the lateral ventricle. Moving on to the anterior cerebral artery, it runs above the optic nerve and follows the curve of corpus callosum. And what structure does it supply deep in the brain? It supplies the internal capsule and basal nuclei. Finally, the middle cerebral artery, where does it travel? It runs along the lateral sulcus of the brain. So let us sum up. Which artery supply the orbit? It's the ophthalmic artery. What connects the internal carotid artery to the posterior cerebral artery? It's the posterior communicating artery. Which artery runs above the optic nerve? It's the anterior cerebral artery. Now let us discuss about the circle of the Willis. So remember, it's a hexagonal circle of the arteries. So it's a basically hexagonal circle of the arteries that distribute the blood around the brain, and it is formed by branches from the anterior cerebral artery, of the internal carotid artery, the terminal parts of the internal carotid artery themselves, and branches from the posterior cerebral artery of the basilar artery. Now, how are the two anterior cerebral arteries? They are connected. They are connected by the anterior communicating artery. This one. And how about the internal carotid arteries and the posterior cerebral arteries of the same side? They are connected by a posterior communicating artery. So the internal carotid artery and branches from the posterior cerebral artery, they are connected via the posterior communicating artery. So this circle, remember, it plays a role in brain's blood supply. So what is its main function? It helps to equalize the blood flow to the different parts of brain and provides backup circulation if one artery it gets blocked. And it is important in diagnosing strokes and other brain conditions. Apart from that, there are cortical branches. They run on the surface of the brain and cause small strokes if they are blocked. There are central branches that go deep into the brain and supply critical areas like the thalamus and the internal capsule. And lastly, the choroid branches, they supply the choroid plexus in the ventricles of the brain. Now let us talk about the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex, it is supplied by branches from all the three cerebral arteries: anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and posterior cerebral artery. Now, which artery is the main supplier to the superior lateral surface of the cerebral cortex? That would be the middle cerebral artery. Which artery dominates the medial surface of the cerebral cortex? It's the anterior cerebral artery. And what about the inferior surface of the cerebral cortex? Which artery is most important? It's the posterior cerebral artery. Now, which artery they supplies the cerebellum? The cerebellum, remember, it is supplied by a superior cerebellar artery, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and posterior inferior cerebellar artery.